Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience and their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's Libsyn, ads.com today.
I'm caught up in the game. My attention is on every play and every whistle. But what I'm missing is a signal coming from my kidneys. That signal isn't like a ref's whistle. It's more of a silent SOS, which could be warning me of an increased risk for events like heart attack or stroke. And a way I can catch that signal? A simple urine test called UACR. If you have type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure, talk to your doctor about the UACR test. Detect the SOS. Visit detectthesos.com to learn more.
If you were to ask a group of brewers for their opinions on what the most important factor in making a quality batch of beer is, my hunch is the vast majority would say something having to do with fermentation temperature control, especially when it comes to lager styles. Unfortunately, the process of cold fermenting a lager is time-consuming, but many folks have adopted a method they swear allows them to ferment warm, thus allowing for quicker turnaround times without the feared side effects. This is the Brülosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to chat about the impact pressurized fermentation has when fermenting lagers warm is contributor Martin Keene.
You know, fermentation temperature control briefly took over my life. At one point when I was starting to get into brewing lagers, I would scan Craigslist to see who was selling chest freezers. And at one point I had, no joke, 5 chest freezers in my basement, all with temperature controllers so I could make sure I was lagering at the right temperature. And then I started to learn about, oh, you know what? You could just ferment these lagers at room temperature as long as you're doing so under pressure. And I ended up selling all of these chest freezers and trying that. So this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, you and me both. I didn't have 5 chest freezers. I had 3 fermentation chambers and 1 7-tap Keyser, which was also a chest freezer. So I technically had 4, but all of my chest freezers at one point were all the 14 cubic foot ones. So there was a point where I had these huge chest freezers in my garage that served the purpose of only beer. We weren't even using them for freezing food or anything like that. So I can absolutely relate with you. And I do think, you know, look, little disclaimer. This is one of those topics that's almost impossible for me to talk about with sprinkling in at least some opinions, mostly because of my experience, though we've done a lot of experiments on warm lager fermentation, on pressurized fermentation, and, you know, so you're going to get a little bit of brews views in this experiment episode as well. But, you know, like I said, there's a lot of people out there who have always viewed lager fermenting as being this kind of difficult thing, and you got to stay away from it for fear of messing it up if you don't have the proper gear and all of that stuff. So we're going to get there, and I have a feeling you have some opinions as well, Martin. So I look forward to hearing some of those from you today. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique perks at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live brew day with a Brülosophy contributor. The tentative plan for this month, February of 2026, is for yours truly to host my very first brew day in my new brewery. The electrician has been out all of this week getting all of my stuff set up. I've got some new, plugs run. It's all getting there. In fact, at the time of this recording, he is on his way to my house to wrap everything up. So I'll be spending the rest of this afternoon prepping my new brewery. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to get there. And I'm just going to be waiting on some ingredients from our friends at Northern Brewer to arrive before I knock it out. And so all that kind of stuff for your patronage. If any of this sounds interesting to you, head over to patreon.com/Brülosophy today to become a patron and help us to continue producing this show as well as everything else we do at Brülosophy. And if you wouldn't mind meantime, please let us know what you think about this show by rating and reviewing it in Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you listen to podcasts. It's one of the simplest ways to help us out, and it only takes a couple of minutes, and it'll help folks who may not have heard of us yet to more easily find the show. Huge thanks to everybody who has already taken the time to do this. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, and I'm getting all set up for their 240-volt 10-gallon setup right now. Both of them are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really does put the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they are intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits. Whatever it is you're looking for, though, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Nathan Cherry wrote in with some feedback after listening to one of our Brew & A episodes from last year. Nathan said, "You and Alex were confused about the mechanics behind conversion in a decoction mash. I'm no expert and have never done a decoction, but here's my 2 cents. To my mind, it all comes down to the diastatic power of the remaining wort. Obviously, taking off a third of the mash and boiling it denatures the enzymes in that portion of the mash, but the remaining wort must have enough diastatic power to convert the sugars of the entire mash when the decocted portion is returned. I imagine there would be a limit of the proportion you can successfully decoct," he says, "which is why this is usually done with only a third of the mash." Martin, are you a decoction expert? Can you speak to this at all?
I have never put myself through a decoction mash on purpose, but I may have kind of got there when I tried to do a party guile, where I ended up, did my big beer, and then I wasn't quite getting the conversion I wanted. So what I normally do is then a mash out stage with the big beer. So I'm not bringing it to a boil like a decoction mash, but I was denaturing all of the enzymes by bringing up that mash bed to about 170 something Fahrenheit. Then I went to do my small beer and I was getting no conversion at all. And that's because I already denatured all the enzymes in that mash. So I think that's, something to keep in mind with the decoction mash as well. Of course, if you took everything and boiled it, then yeah, you're not going to be able to get any sort of diastatic power from this. So it makes sense to me that it would not be more than about a third for those reasons.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm with you. I've never put myself through the torture of a decoction mash. That doesn't even sound enjoyable to me, and brewing is a hobby, so I don't have any plans to do a decoction as much as that might bother some people. I've also had several decocted beers that I don't really notice the mystical decoction character in. So I'm not sold that it actually does much for the perceptible qualities of beer. I think it was more something that we did in the past, or that brewers did in the past, to encourage, attenuation and all of the stuff we're looking for in fermentation. That being said, Nathan's way of thinking about how decoctions work in terms of conversion is more or less how I've just always presumed it worked. I mean, if boiling wasn't an issue, boiling the mash or the wort wasn't an issue, then why not just boil the whole mash? Probably because when brewers of yore tried that, they found it didn't work very well. So yeah, I think that's probably a good presumption, Nathan. I'm with you on that. I can almost guarantee I'm going to get emails correcting us on what's actually happening, and that's fine. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Be sure to pick up your Brülosophy merch, which you can find by visiting brülosophy.com/shop. We're offering more options than we ever have before, from t-shirts, hoodies, and hats to fanny packs, shorts, and coffee mugs, among many, many other things. We've done our best to keep prices reasonable, and international shipping is now available. Again, you can head to brülosophy.com/shop and click one of the product images on that page, which will redirect you to our Dashery store, or you can go there directly, brülosophy.dashery.com. We've also put a link in the description of this episode.
Imagine you're a business owner relying on a dozen different software programs. Each one is expensive, overly complicated, and worst of all, none of them are connected. It can be incredibly stressful, right? Now, picture Odoo. CRM, accounting, inventory, manufacturing, marketing, HR, and more. Odoo brings all the tools your business needs into one simple platform, and all seamlessly connected. Everything works together, giving you the peace of mind that your business is running smoothly from every angle. Odoo's open source applications are user-friendly and designed to scale with your business, saving you time and money. Say goodbye to juggling multiple platforms and hello to efficient integrated management. Stop wasting resources on complicated systems and make the switch to Odoo today. Visit odoo.com, ODOO.com, and discover how Odoo can simplify and streamline your business operations. Odoo, modern management made simple.
On eBay, every find has a story. Like if you're looking for a vintage band tee. Not just a tee, the band tee. From the last show your favorite band ever played. You wore it everywhere. Then, your BFF started wearing it. Which is cute, until they unfriended you and took it with them. Which was not so cute. Anyway, now you're on eBay. And there it is. Same tee from the same tour. Still living in your memory, rent-free forever. See? The things you love have a way of finding their way back to you. But eBay isn't just for getting whatever your ex-BFF stole back. It's also for that rare championship foul ball you caught, then heroically gave to the kid next to you. And where else are you going to find your first car? The one you wish you never sold, but now you finally get the chance to take back home. For good this time. Shop eBay for millions of finds, each with a story. eBay. Things people love.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
I'm U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy. The sound of a seatbelt. It's one of the most important sounds in our car. It means everyone is ready and everyone is safe. The more our kids see us put on our seatbelts, the more natural it is for them to put theirs on too. Make it a priority. Buckle up every time. Hear the sound? Make it a habit.
Paid for by NHTSA.
Alrighty, show of hands. How many of you listening right now avoided or perhaps even currently avoid making lagers due to the apparent requirement that they be fermented cool and lagered over a long period of time? I have a feeling more than a few of you are in this boat. If you have your hands up, go ahead and put them back down, put them on your steering wheel, be safe. I certainly was in this boat, but I'm not anymore. I brew more lager than anything else these days, and it takes the same amount of time as any ale that I make, but that's only because I'm a terrible human being who's ruining this hobby by fermenting them warm. I know this is a terrible thing. Now, before we start digging into pressurized fermentation specifically, I was thinking maybe we could start with just some generals of fermentation temperature and the importance of fermentation temperature control.
Yeah, Marshall, your general terribleness as a human being was actually what first alerted me to Brülosophy and all of this talk about Brülosophy would take lagers and ferment them at room temperature. What on earth were they doing? Yeah, so, right. So, I mean, the thinking here is that we're looking at the temperature of yeast during fermentation, and the idea with lagering is that cooler temperatures with lager yeasts are associated with cleaner fermentation. And the reason for that is that when you are fermenting at a lower temperature, you are essentially suppressing ester development. So esters are kind of the compounds that can give you sort of fruity notes in your beer, which could be something you definitely are chasing and want, but maybe not if you're trying to create a clean lager. So a good way to do that purportedly is to just make sure that you ferment at a nice low temperature to avoid that ester development.
Exactly. That is the common knowledge about lagers, and we could dig into the history if we want. I don't know how deep we want to go down that rabbit hole, but you got to remember that at the time that these beers were being developed, technology was all but absent. I mean, it was rudimentary technology. We knew there was some understanding that there's something in the environment that causes this stuff that we call wort to turn into this stuff that we call beer, and the way that it worked, was different. But you had these folks who started started storing their fermentation vessels in caves that were cool. That seems to have naturally selected yeast that operate better at those temperatures. And it seems somewhere along the line, we developed this belief, and that's what I'm going to call it for the purposes of this episode, that not necessarily that, wow, this lager or this yeast does really well at cold temperatures. It became, wow, because it does well, you have to do it that way now. You can't do it any other way. And that's how I tend to perceive it, which I know, again, is blasphemous to the core.
Right. And of course, there are some potential issues with all of this. I mean, if we lower the temperature, I mean, I think, as you always say, Marshall, when you make things cooler, then stuff just happens slower. And one of the things that happens slower is fermentation can take a bit longer to get going. I mean, I've certainly noticed that in my own brewing. If I am pitching into kind of 68 Fahrenheit or 20 Celsius wort with a ale yeast, I'm going to see activity in the airlock pretty quickly. If I'm pitching into much cooler wort with some lager yeast, it could be a full day until I see anything going on. And that time period, that gives you the potential for a risk of contamination, because something else could be basically consuming all of those rich sugars in that wort instead of the yeast that you want. So the first thing to be concerned about, I think, when you are fermenting so much cooler is, well, am I going to end up with a sluggish fermentation? And is that sluggish fermentation going to end up with a potential risk of contamination?
Yeah, that's one of the main reasons. And this is not an episode where we're going to focus too much on yeast pitch rates and propagation of yeast in starters and all that stuff. But this is why recommended yeast pitch rates for traditionally fermented lagers is different than what it is for ale. Because if you're pitching highly viable, meaning just a lot of yeast, a lot of active, awake, and ready to go cells into a cold fermented wort, it is going to reduce that lag time, which thus reduces the risk for potential contamination by other, microbes that might have made their way into your wort. They're there, and so we do everything we can to keep them out. But the typical understanding is that you pitch your yeast as soon as possible to outcompete anything else that might be there. So yeah, absolutely a big risk. Another one is poor attenuation. The colder you get that wort, even though lager yeast, which we'll talk about more specifically here in a minute, have been, again, naturally selected to perform well in cooler environments. There's still a possibility that they're going to putter out just due to that cool temperature and not fully, attenuate the beer, which is why a lot of people do a diacetyl rest. That's also to knock off diacetyl, of course, but by increasing that temperature, you're increasing the activity of the yeast as well.
Right, and the diacetyl rest, as you mentioned there, Marshall, basically, I mean, the concern there is just sort of the fact that you have an unfinished fermentation. So all yeast produce diacetyl during the early stages of fermentation, but typically at the end of fermentation, the yeast kind of clean up after themselves and they reabsorb that. But if the temperature is lower, it's possible that the yeast are just going to become dormant and they'll drop out of suspension a bit too early and they won't finish that cleanup phase. And that is when you get these diacetyl kind of bombs. That is the concern of not raising the temperature at the end to make sure the cleanup stage does happen. So that's definitely a potential off flavor with lager temperatures.
Yeah. Now, so we've talked about some of the issues with cold fermenting in general. Obviously, when it comes to lager styles, there are more benefits, perceived benefits, we'll say, of fermenting them cool. The main one being the suppression of any sort of ester or phenol characteristics. You don't want I don't know of a lager beer where those are desired. So that, I'm speaking in generalities here, but I don't mean to offend anybody. That's not typically characteristics you want in a nice, clean German Pilsner or Helles or something like that. So by fermenting cool, it's, you are suppressing the development of these fermentation byproducts that otherwise, you aren't allowed in lagers. So the idea behind, when you start talking about, and the reason I make fun of myself for fermenting lagers warm is because these warmer temperatures are associated with the development of these certain flavor characteristics, namely increased fruity esters. Warmer temperatures will promote increased yeast metabolic activity and growth, which in turn leads to greater production of the enzymes and precursors required for the formation of esters. And that is what traditional lager brewers are very intentionally trying to keep at a minimum, is the development of those esters. And you think about it, this is just, again, I can't talk about this stuff without sprinkling in at least some of my weird way of thinking about stuff, Martin. So I apologize if this bothers anyone, but in the grand scheme of things, 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees C versus 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees C isn't that vast. It sounds like it in the world of lager beer, or brewing in general, because we tend to kind of focus on very specific numbers, especially as it relates to temperature. But is 10 degrees Celsius really going to make that big of a difference? Yeast can ferment upwards of, I've very intentionally look at Kvike. You can ferment that at like 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeah, you can do that with most other yeast strains as well. It might produce some off flavors on all of that, but that's up near 100 degrees Fahrenheit. What's that? 35, 36 C, something like that. But we have just hyper focused on this 10 degree Celsius or 18 degree Fahrenheit difference as being a basically the director of what the beer ends up tasting like. I don't know. That's how I look at it.
It's interesting you say that, because part of the reason I think we do focus on that is just it's correlated with the effort involved, because It's very easy for me to ferment anything at 68 or 70 Fahrenheit, 19, 20 Celsius, because I just leave it out in my basement and that's the room temperature. It's really an effort for me to do 10 degrees cooler than that. That's where I need to be scouring Craigslist. So you know what? If I've gone to the trouble of getting those chest freezers and setting them to the right temperature and putting it in there, I really hope that 10 degrees is making a difference. But like you say, I mean, it's not a big deal.
Well, you and I are saying we don't think it's that big of a deal because we're stupid people who ferment warm nowadays. But here's the thing: we're going to get into the whole pressurized fermentation thing. That is where things get interesting, albeit maybe not meaningful, but interesting at the very least. So another issue that's associated with warm fermentation of lager beers in particular, but it applies to any type of beer, is the increased fusel alcohols. And this is just a function of increased yeast metabolism leading to faster consumption of free amino nitrogen, or FAN, as well as sugars. And that this can lead to the conversion of amino acids into fusel alcohols. If you're unfamiliar with what a fusel alcohol is, the best way I had it described to me many, many years ago was, if you can smell or taste the booze, that's probably, and I'm not saying feel it. I'm talking about smell alcohol, taste the alcohol. Those are those higher fusel alcohols typically. It can come across as kind of a sharp, fruity type of characteristic. I'm not a fan of it at all. And there are folks out there who will claim that fusel alcohols are a big contributor to hangovers, to headaches, stuff like that.
Yeah, so when we're talking about cooler temperatures, we're like, well, things might work too slowly. That's where we have diacetyl concerns. And now when we're talking about warmer temperatures, things might happen too quickly, which, the fusel alcohols is a great example of that, because the yeast is creating ethanol, but if it's under stress and if it's moving too quickly, it can kind of break down amino acids from the FAN in the malt and then basically create these higher alcohols, these fusels, which are, the boozy kind of tastes. And then the other off flavors from going too fast could be acetaldehyde, that kind of green apple flavor, because the yeast just finishes so quickly and it settles before it can clean up its byproduct again. So it's really just the other end of the spectrum of things that can be caused by going too quickly instead of too slowly.
Yeah, and just a side note on acetaldehyde, when I've had what do they call them? Flavor standards, like when you're dosing a Miller Lite or some light, lager with actual acetaldehyde, it does not taste like green apple to me. I've never gotten green apple from a beer that I at the very least presumed acetaldehyde was in there. To me, it tastes like raw pumpkin, or it smells more like raw pumpkin, or like a raw zucchini, that kind of squash smell. It's really earthy. It's not very pleasant, in my opinion. If you've ever brought a beer up to it's usually homebrew. I'm going to be honest. I don't know if I can think of a single commercial beer that has actual levels of acetaldehyde. People will say Bud Light. I think that's intentional, and I think it's a function of the yeast that they're using that they want in that beer. It's what makes it unique. I don't think it's acetaldehyde. But if you've ever had like a home brew and you're drinking it and you're like, what is that weird, earthy kind of, it can almost be like a cut grass, but really to me, it's more squash-like. That is an indicator of acetaldehyde. There's not really any other ingredients that we're using to make beer that tastes like raw pumpkin or smell like raw pumpkin. So keep that in mind. Now we're talking about, the differences between what we're terming ale yeast and lager yeast and the beers that you make using both of those. Scientifically, you've heard this a million times. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is ale yeast. It performs really well, or it's known to perform really well at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take, which is 20 C. Lager yeast is Saccharomyces pastorianus. There's also, I believe, Saccharomyces carlsbergensis, and those are like two different families of lager yeast. Again, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but suffice to say, lager yeasts in general, particularly those of the pastorianus family here, are in a way hybridized. It's a hybridized strain. So you had, I hope I don't get this wrong, but you had Sac cerevisiae basically mating with Sac eubionis, and that ultimately produced what we now refer to as the various versions of Saccharomyces pastorianus, which are these lager yeast strains, which do perform really well at cooler temperatures, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees C.
I'm not going to argue with that. I have no idea.
I could be wrong. I could be completely wrong. That's just like my red. But.
Yeah. So of course it all comes down to the beer style that you're brewing, and it's not as simple as saying, oh, it's a lager yeast we want clean, and it's an ale yeast we want estery. It comes down to the style that you're going for. So, for example, an American ale, you might want it estery, but there's a good chance you actually want that clean, even though you're using ale yeast. A British ale, you absolutely would want some amount of ester content, so perhaps you would ferment a little warmer because of that. And then, most lagers, including the one we're going to talk about later, you'd really want that to be pretty clean. So it just really depends upon the beer style as much as the actual ale or lager yeast that you're using.
Exactly. And the thing I know that when I was really starting to learn about different yeast strains and particularly as it relates to lager brewing and ale brewing, I was like, how can let's just take a Belgian ale strain. How can that be the same in this, even remotely similar to like the Chico strain? They produce completely different, byproducts you can taste and smell. They just are. They, in the same way that every human being can, looks different, does different things, has different outputs, if you will. So do yeast, and they're still a part of that same family. And so that's just one way to think about it. Now, let's move into the talk about pressurized fermentation. And this is one of those things, for me at least, that probably, I don't know, up until maybe 8 to 10 years ago, had never even crossed my mind. I didn't notice people talking about it. I'm sure it was being done on the professional or commercial scale, but homebrewers, it, for the most part, it wasn't really a thing. Then, I don't know, 10-ish years ago, it became this widely discussed way to get around, warm fermentation of lagers. And we'd already started, I'm not patting ourselves on the back, we'd already started experimenting with fermenting lagers warm at ambient pressure, and people were giving us a ton of shit about that. And it's fine. We put ourselves out there. But then suddenly, like, the magic of pressurized fermentation came along, and everybody was okay with warm fermentation so long as you do it under 12 PSI, right?
Yeah, exactly. This seems like the ultimate hack, that suddenly we don't have to care about fermentation temperature so much anymore. Right. We will just go with room temperature, whatever, just leave your keg out or your pressurized vessel out, and just make sure that you keep the PSI, somewhere around sort of under 15 PSI, and then suddenly everything is going to be good. And, there's some arguments for why that would work, because essentially you're now fermenting, let's say, at room temperature, 68 Fahrenheit, 20 Celsius. So this is a warm fermentation. But all of those things we just talked about of, concerns of that warm fermentation of the yeast, basically fermenting too quickly, leaving behind off flavors and stuff like that. The idea is it's kind of countered by the pressure. So the ester formation, well, the idea of going under pressure is that we are now actually suppressing some of that ester formation because that pressure is reducing the metabolism of the yeast. So the yeast is still kind of acting, it's basically working slower, and that's going to inhibit the formation of those esters simply because of the fact that we are now making the environment a little bit harder for the yeast to propagate.
And look, I couldn't find any articles on this, and that may just be because I don't have access to the libraries where those articles are. But ChatGPT told me that there is actual scientific evidence that supports this claim, right? That that pressure during fermentation, particularly between that 8 to 15 psi range, stresses the yeast enough to slow down that metabolism. Stress isn't always a bad thing. When we're talking about stress with yeast, we're saying that it's applying some sort of external pressure, no pun intended there, on that yeast such that it's going to perform a little bit differently. That's all. And in this case, the way I view pressurized fermentation is if you view lager temperature as being the volume knob, and you for those who play guitar or dabble in recording, you'll understand this analogy. Fermentation temperature is the volume knob, pressure is the gain knob, and you have to balance those to get them right where you want it to sit. You could actually, it's a little bit different, but you could go a little bit higher on the gain and a little bit lower on the volume, or a little bit higher on the volume and a little bit lower on the gain to achieve more or less the same thing. And that's sort of the way the whole lager fermentation temperature plus pressurized fermentation works, in my mind at least. So the other thing that when you apply pressure during fermentation, it's going to retard yeast growth. That pressure is, again, it's this stressor that slows the yeast down, like you said, Martin. And that is the key. That's the idea is, okay, now that we know that this pressure is going to suppress ester formation and slow that yeast growth down, we can now use pressure to our advantage by warming up the fermentation temperature so that we can, blast through making these beers a bit faster than we used to in the old days. And it gives us it makes us feel, I don't know, comfortable doing something that is otherwise like against the rules, right?
Yeah, exactly. So now you've got the sort of the choice of, how many sort of what sort of ester presence do you want? Do you want prominent esters or really no kind of esters? We want clean, and then you just pick your PSI accordingly, right? So if I want to create a super clean lager or even an ale that we don't want a lot of ester development in, well then I'm just gonna pump that up to maybe 12 psi of pressure and then leave it at room temperature, and I should be able to suppress the esters that way. And I also have the advantage that I'm basically carbonating the beer during fermentation as well. So I've cut out another stage of having to force carbonate at the end. So it's a very convenient way to be able to get those sort of potentially the sort of cleaner result from the fermentation just by adding a little bit of pressure.
That is how it's sold to brewers, and I think that's a wonderful thing if it works. So again, obviously, I think the styles where we did a past episode, I think it was back in August or something, on pressurized fermentation and the impact it has on Belgian ale. And the reason that we did that experiment is because, well, hey, look, if fermenting under pressure suppresses ester and phenol development, then if you've got two Belgian ales that are supposed to have those characteristics in them, and you apply pressure to one and the other one is fermented under ambient pressure, which is 0 bar, then you would expect the Belgian one to have fewer phenols and esters, the stuff that you expect in that beer. I'll let you go back and listen to that episode to hear all about that yourself. But in lagers, it's sort of the opposite. You want to suppress those characteristics by fermenting under pressure, but you want to get that beer done faster. Now, the style that you focused on in the experiment we're going to talk about here in a minute is German Helles Exportbier, which I feel like is it's a pretty perfect style for this because it's slightly stronger than your typical, German Pils or Munich Helles. So you're again applying a little bit more stress to that yeast to get the job done. And so you really want the higher that OG of the wort, the more concerned you're going to be for the production of off flavors. And again, for a lot of people, the more important it becomes to keep that fermentation cool, or in this case, potentially to keep that pressure on the beer during fermentation. So the BJCP describes German Helles Exportbier as a golden German lager balancing a smooth, malty profile with a bitter, hoppy character in a slightly above average body and strength beer. So what would you expect if you fermented a German Helles, based on tradition at least, a German Helles Exportbier under no pressure at ale temperatures?
Well, look, this is such a wonderful style. It would really be a struggle to do that, because I think I'm ruining this wonderful beer by doing that. And by ruining it, what I'm doing is I'm probably adding the potential for some sort of fruity esters, which is absolutely not what I want in my Helles Exportbier. There's potential, this is going to be maybe a 6 or 7% beer. I do not want it to taste boozy, but there's the potential for fusel alcohol in there as well. And the body of the beer, I could possibly end up with a bit of a thin body, because I maybe have over attenuated by fermenting at those warmer temperatures.
The thinner bodied and mouthfeel thing is something that I used to hear a lot from people just about warmer fermentation temperatures together or altogether. The idea being that if you're really encouraging the yeast to get in there and get out of the way as fast as possible by fermenting warm, it might over attenuate a bit. And so, with lagers, if you're fermenting one 20 degrees warmer than the packet of yeast says you should, then there's some concern that some might hold that it's going to be a thinner bodied, a thinner mouthfeel type of beer. So I've been fermenting lagers warm without any pressure for almost a decade now. And while I've been happy with the results, if adding a little bit of pressure made them taste even more lager-like, I'd be fully down. I've got the gear to do it. It's insanely easy if you're fermenting in kegs or pressurizable fermentation vessels. Well, you were curious how a German Helles Exportbier fermented warm under pressure would compare to one fermented warm under no pressure, and so you designed an experiment to test it out. Those results when we're back from this break.
On eBay, every find has a story. Like if you're looking for a vintage band tee. Not just a tee, the band tee. From the last show your favorite band ever played. You wore it everywhere. Then, your BFF started wearing it. Which is cute, until they unfriended you and took it with them. Which was not so cute. Anyway, now you're on eBay. And there it is. Same tee from the same tour. Still living in your memory, rent-free forever. See? The things you love have a way of finding their way back to you. But eBay isn't just for getting whatever your ex-BFF stole back. It's also for that rare championship foul ball you caught, then heroically gave to the kid next to you. And where else are you going to find your first car? The one you wish you never sold, but now you finally get the chance to take back home. For good this time. Shop eBay for millions of finds, each with a story. eBay. Things people love.
I'm U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy. The sound of a seatbelt. It's one of the most important sounds in our car. It means everyone is ready and everyone is safe. The more our kids see us put on our seatbelts, the more natural it is for them to put theirs on too. Make it a priority. Buckle up every time. Hear the sound? Make it a habit.
Paid for by NHTSA.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today.
I'm U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy. The sound of a seatbelt. It's one of the most important sounds in our car. It means everyone is ready and everyone is safe. The more our kids see us put on our seatbelts, the more natural it is for them to put theirs on too. Make it a priority. Buckle up every time. Hear the sound? Make it a habit.
Paid for by NHTSA.
When I started homebrewing, the thought of fermenting a lager warm was enough to cause some folks' head to explode. Sometime in the last decade or so, though, that started to change, with some blasphemous brewers like yours truly reporting great results from doing exactly that, fermenting lagers at ale temperatures, while others maintained that it absolutely guaranteed that that beer was going to be a dumper. That is until the idea of pressurized fermentation hit. Voila! The magic pill that eliminates all of the ills of warm fermentation. But is it really as effective as they claim? You performed an experiment, Martin, to see for yourself.
Yes, indeed. So yeah, I picked German Helles Exportbier because I felt this was such a, well, mainly so I wanted to brew one and needed an excuse, and this was the perfect excuse. So I put together a recipe for this. Pretty simple. It's basically, I'm going to brew one big 10-gallon batch and then split it across two 5-gallon fermenters, and then we would perform the variable there. And the malt bill was basically mostly Pilsner malt, 91% Pilsner malt. And then I mixed in 4.5% of both Munich malt and Vienna malt. I think I may have got this layering kind of idea from you, Marshall, originally, of mixing Munich and Vienna in that sort of layered 50-50 approach.
Yeah, it's pretty simple, I think. I mean, I like your recipe here. It's something that I would do. I'm not sure 4.5. I'm not convinced these days that 4.5% of Vienna malt's going to be terribly noticeable. But hey, it adds a little bit, to the mix. So.
Right. So at that point, I cracked out my my Clawhammer Supply brew kettle, which will do 10-gallon batches. So it's a 20-gallon kettle, and mashed in at 152 Fahrenheit, 67 Celsius, a pretty standard mash temperature that I use for almost everything, and performed that mash rest for 60 minutes. Then when the mash rest was complete, it was a pretty simple hop addition. Now this beer, you do want to add a little bit of bitterness to it, more than you might for a sort of a standard German lager. So I was shooting for around 25 IBU, and the way I got there was by using Hallertau Mittelfrüh at 60 minutes. I had 35 grams in at the start of the boil, and then with 10 minutes to go, that's when I added some more Hallertau Mittelfrüh, 10 grams of that, and 10 grams of Tettnang, just to kind of round things out.
Yeah, Helles in general isn't supposed to be an in-your-face hoppy beer, and I think that characteristic works really well for an experiment like this, where we really want to emphasize any differences caused by warm fermentation overall. So Tettnang, obviously my favorite noble hop, one of my top 5 favorite hops of all time. But this looks like a solid, you're not going too bitter, but you're going just bitter enough to balance that sweetness from the higher OG, and then also sprinkling in just some nice noble hop characteristics. I want a glass of this right now. Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah. It sounds fantastic. So after the boil was complete, then I quickly chilled the wort, and then I split it across 2 fermenters so we could introduce the variable. And at that point, I did take a gravity reading to see that my OG was 1056. So that's a pretty good base for a beer that I was hoping to come out around sort of 6% ABV.
Perfect. I mean, 1056. That's money for this style. But as as listeners might be noticing, this is a bit stronger than a typical Helles, hence the export beer label, which has become a BJCP style. It used to be called Dortmunder Export. They now refer to it as Helles Export, German Helles Exportbier. But 1056, not a weak beer by any means. And again, that higher OG is going to force that yeast to work harder, which thus leads to, ostensibly at least, the potential production of more esters and such.
Yep, exactly. So I chilled my wort down all the way just to 68 Fahrenheit, 20C, which felt very wrong. And at that point, I went to pitch my yeast into each batch. Now, the yeast that I was using was from White Labs, and it is called Mythical Hammer, which is a yeast that was put together between White Labs and Clawhammer Supply, which is kind of how it got onto my radar. And this yeast is intended specifically to be used during pressurized fermentation. So it's actually listed in the description that this is a multifaceted lager yeast blend capable of pressure fermentation. And it's recommended that you ferment somewhere between 12 to 15 psi, or basically 1 bar of pressure, and that will give you kind of a crisp beer, which you could apply to any sort of lager style, like light lager or a cold IPA, something like that. So I'm actually using a beer that is intended to be put under pressure.
Excellent. Yeah, I've never used this yeast. It's weird to me that there's a strain that's designed specifically for pressurized fermentation. But again, what a great pick for this experiment, because not only are we looking at, the impact of warm fermentation at a no, 0 bar, fermented under no pressure, but now you've got this yeast that they're saying ferment this one under pressure. So we'll get to see if there's any differences there as well.
Yeah. So up until this point, everything had been the same, but here is where the variable comes in. So both beers are now in their fermenter, and now we are going to apply the variable, which is to add 12 psi of pressure into one of the fermenters and leave the other one at ambient pressure. So the way that I did that was just, I'm using stainless steel fermenters, conical fermenters here that allow me up to, I think, 15 psi of pressure. So even though the yeast recommends going up to 15 psi of pressure, I didn't want to push my equipment to the limit. So I went with 12 as kind of a middle ground. So what I did was I basically put a spunding valve on both of the conical fermenters, and then I added in 12 psi of CO2 into one. I added no pressure into the other, and I set the spunding valve on one to 12 psi and the other to 0 psi. So that way, as CO2 is being generated during fermentation, all of it is going out of the airlock through the spunding valve for one batch, and the other one is maintaining enough CO2 to keep me at 12 psi of pressure and then expending the rest.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, 12 psi is the standard that's recommended for pressurized fermentation, at least as far as I know, for home brewers. I'm not sure exactly what it is that commercial brewers are doing, but we'll hit on that here in a minute. The other thing is, I love how, if this isn't a testament to how dorky we are, technically you could have just put an airlock, on the 0 pressure fermentation batch, but you did the same exact thing as you did with the pressurized fermentation batch and just set the spunding valve to be open, basically to not hold any pressure whatsoever. Again, who knows? I don't think any of us actually believe that the type of airlock that you're using is going to somehow impact the organoleptic, characteristics of beer, but we want to make sure that that's not even a factor at play, and so I appreciate the fact that you took that extra step.
Yes. Listeners should know that as a Brülosophy contributor, this is drilled into us that even if we think some kind of difference wouldn't matter, it is vital that everything is identical apart from one thing, the thing that relates to the variable. So yeah.
It's funny you say that because, prior to starting this episode, recording this episode, you and I were just catching up, and I made a comment about how aggravating it is when, we're administering surveys and people think that we're just doing it as a joke or for fun. And I'm like, no, man, I've had to put my foot down a few times. It's the same way with the way we design these experiments. We do everything we can to isolate the variable or variables that we're testing. And you did a great job of that with this one.
So the beers were left to ferment, and both were bubbling away. There wasn't any obvious difference during the fermentation that I could see, although of course I don't actually have a visual view of the beer because these are stainless steel fermenters. But after 10 days, I did take gravity readings of both beers. So this is a chance to see if there was any kind of measurable difference between these beers, having gone through such different amounts of pressure during their fermentation. And the results were the no pressure or the 0 pressure or the ambient pressure beer, that had reached a final gravity of 1.006. The one that was under 12 psi of pressure was at 1.007, which I am going to call basically a statistical tie.
Yeah, people will say, "Oh no," but you did the thing, but I just don't think that one specific talk about taking a magnifying glass to temperatures. This is even more small than a 1 degree Fahrenheit, difference. One specific gravity point, that could just be a function of measurement error. It could be, but again, you're using a digital refractometer, which is awesome. I have a feeling that if you were to drop a hydrometer into those beers, they would show pretty much the same reading. So again, I'm going to chalk it up, at least at this point, I'm going to chalk it up to just natural variability between, 2 batches of beer.
Yeah. Now, there is still another variable at play here that I needed to eliminate, which is now I'm ready to move the beers into packaging, and in this case, moving them into 2 kegs. But one of the beers is already carbonated and the other is not. The other one's basically flat. So both beers were then hooked up to 12 psi of pressure in my Kieser, where they sat for 3 weeks, at which point then the beer that had been fermenting at 0 psi had a chance to catch up and get carbonated. So they both received the same amount of pressure for the same amount of time, so that they were both evenly carbonated by the end of that.
Perfect. So, we're to the point now where you can drink the beers are ready to be served, and you pour a couple of glasses and you set them next to each other and you take a beautiful photo. And I'm looking at that photo right now, Martin. They look identical to me. Now, I didn't see these beers in real life, but I also wouldn't expect there to be any differences in the way they look based on the pressure. I do suppose that maybe clarity there could be something with the clarity aspect of it due to pressure, and the one I would maybe, but you let them lager long enough that even if there was in the beginning, maybe that had already kind of corrected for itself. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
So you're telling me you can't see the esters? You can't see the difference in esters, huh?
Or the phenols, yeah.
That's right.
Or the fusels, I should say, yeah.
Yeah. The beers look identical. Yeah, they were, let's say, lagered for about 3 weeks. I did not find them. We generally don't find a lot of the experiment beers, just in case there's any kind of impact from that. So they're not crystal clear, but they both look pretty good to me.
They look perfect to me. I mean, the photos are, the glasses are obviously condensated, and so I'm trying to mentally remove the condensation, and that is beyond homebrew clear, maybe not commercially bright, but pretty damn close. So now, for every experiment, we clarify this every episode, I know, but before we administer the triangle test to a panel of blind tasters, we do a series of what we refer to as semi-blind triangle tests ourselves, where we serve ourselves, or we have somebody in our family serve us 5 triangle tests. The reason we say semi-blind is because we know the variable, but we don't know what beer is in what glasses. And for us, we actually let the person, our children or our wives pretty much, mix up which one is the odd beer out, and so that's our one way. That's my way of justifying keeping this stupid part of this in the articles. I hate this thing. I've talked about it a million times. But in your case, out of the 5 semi-blind triangle tests that you took, how well did you perform on them?
Well, I took the test 5 times and I got the same result every time. So that's a success, right? The same result
Total
every time?
Success. Very good consistency, Martin. Yes.
Yeah. The same result was I got it wrong every time. So I looked this up afterwards. What is the statistical probability that even if I'm just randomly guessing and picking out a beer at random, that I could get it wrong 5 times in a row? It's actually not that rare. Do you know what what those statistics are, Marshall?
The out of 5, I mean, you would expect if you've got 3 beers in front of you, one is different, then on each attempt, the odds of you selecting the odd beer out is 33%. And that's if they're all identical, right? So the odds of you picking the same one over consistently is 33%. So I don't know what the exact numbers are for out of a series of 5 blind triangle attempts that you wouldn't get it right once, but it is statistically improbable. But that's just how randomness works. We've all experienced this. I've done this as well. You could put, like I said, if you served anybody 5 triangle tests of the same beer in 3 different colored cups, chances are they're going to pick different color, the different beers, different colors at different times. That's at some point. But in your case, you just happen to not get it, which does seem to indicate that, at least for you, you perceived no real meaningful difference, at least perceptibly, in terms of flavor, aroma, and mouthfeel between either of these beers. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is fair. And the answer, by the way, is 13%.
13%. Wow.
Yeah. So I felt pretty special there. Now, of course, this is amplified by the fact I am doing this live on camera for the Brülosophy show episode that we did for this experiment. So there I am sort of confidently predicting, oh, it's red. And then it's absolutely not red. And then you start second guessing like, well, okay, so it turned out it was green. There's no way my wife would use green again as the odd one out, is there? And then you start, I could not tell any difference. To me, these beers were identical in every way. Mouthfeel, smell, aroma, everything. I just could not tell a difference.
Yeah. And, obviously you have a terrible palate, and that's why you couldn't tell these apart. And so that's objective fact, Martin. We're not talking opinion here. You suck at tasting things.
Fair. That's fair.
That's fair. You and me both, pal. But that is the reason that we serve this to blind tasters is we don't want to inform them of anything. We don't want to give them any hints as to what might be different so that they can hyper focus on that. We keep them completely blind to the variable. If they ask what the style of beer is, we'll tell them. I mean, we don't have an issue with that, but we're not going to give any hints whatsoever as to what the variable that is being tested is. And so we make it a point to do our best to get at least 20 participants, which is the number that you got for this experiment. Out of those 20, 11 would have to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with at least some level of confidence that, it really does seem that the variable at play here, which in our case is pressurized fermentation of a warm lager, that really did seem to have a meaningful impact because it better explains the performance of these blind tasters than randomness, right? That is all we're looking at. We're not trying to say that, it's a bigger deal than it is. So out of 20 participants, 11 would have been expected to get it right. How many in the end actually identified the unique sample?
A total of 6, which is basically 30%, which is basically just complete random chance. And let me tell you, no one was more relieved that this came back as non-significant than me after getting a 0 out of 5. Because if this came back significant and everybody could tell and I got it wrong every time, it would have been quite embarrassing. But yeah, I was not alone.
So I have to take back my objective finding that your palate sucks. It's that all of our tasters' palate sucks as well. Obvious. I mean, that's what the hardcore, lager brewers are going to say. Well, they got to find better tasters. Chances are, buddy, if you're thinking that, you suck just as much as we do. I'm just going to put it out there. Ego is something that has been around in every hobby, particularly homebrewing, as far as I know, for as long as it's existed. If you hang that up and you start to actually look at the evidence, though, it's pretty interesting. And this finding here is such, it's in many ways validating because not only are we saying that pressurized fermentation, at least on our scale, doesn't seem to have much of a meaningful impact, we're also showing that a warm fermented German Helles Exportbier was rather well received. You seem to like it. I'll let you talk on that here in a minute. But my understanding based on the video is that other people liked it quite a bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a well received beer. Well, both of the beers were well received. And yeah, I took this to my local homebrew club. So a lot of beer nerds were tasting this beer and, evaluating it, knowing what to expect for this particular style. And it was very well received, and basically nobody could tell the difference.
Yeah, I mean, that's just, and here's the thing. I guarantee we've got fans of the show who still absolutely disagree with us on the whole warm fermentation of lager thing. I appreciate that. That's fine. We really don't care. It's fun to make fun of ourselves and you guys every once in a while. That's just being homies, whatever. But again, this to me just sends even more validation my way that first off, warm fermentation is fine. What I guess part of the way I think about it, Martin, is that you've got people who are making it okay to warm ferment by using pressure, and I'm sitting here saying Well, that pressure is an illusory prophylactic. It's not doing what you think it's doing, but keep doing it if you want to turn your warm fermented beers around and tell people that, oh, don't worry about it. I did it under pressure, so it's okay. I'm going to do it without that pressure, save some CO2, and it's still going to be okay is the way I take this. Now, obviously, it could be that other things are at play. It could be that it's the specific yeast strain. I'm still utterly convinced that this could also be a matter of scale, that a lot of what we do for our tiny little 5-gallon batches just doesn't really apply in the same way that it would to a 40-barrel fermentation tank, or there are other pressures at play there. And I think it behooves us to at least acknowledge that could be a reason professional brewers do things differently than we need to do on the homebrew scale. But for some people, it's fun to pretend you're a commercial brewer in your garage. Keep doing what you do. This right here, for those of you out there who have embraced the warm fermentation of lagers, that approach, then keep on doing what you're doing. Now, this was one of those unique experiments where we partnered with White Labs and we actually sent these beers off to be tested in a lab for various things. Martin, I'm going to let you go over all this data because I know that you're the one who coordinated with White Labs for all of this, but it's some pretty interesting findings.
It is so wild to see my little home-brewed beer that I made in my basement been taken to a lab, and I got sent a load of footage of this thing being tested with people in lab coats, with professional equipment, messing around with my little old beer and taking it seriously. It was absolutely crazy to see. The Brülosophy show episode, there's a whole bunch of footage so you can see kind of the things they tested.
Yeah.
It was very interesting to see what they came back with in terms of results. So, for example, things that they tested were alcohol by volume. Now, alcohol by volume is something that we homebrewers can very easily calculate ourselves just by measuring the difference between the original gravity and the final gravity. And it turns out that the lab reported alcohol by volume was basically identical to what I was getting just from calculating that. So the 0 PSI sample was coming back with an ABV of 6.45, and the 12 PSI sample was 6.6. And remember, there was a 1-point difference in final gravity, so that was kind of explained by that. The color was, the SRM color was basically the same. It was 3.68 for the 0 PSI batch and 3.73 for the 12 PSI batch. My brewing software told me I would get an SRM of 5.1, so it was slightly paler than expected, but, basically a 1.5 off. So I thought that was pretty good. They also measured the pH of the beer, and there was a difference here in the pH, which I thought was interesting. So the 0 PSI sample had a pH of 4.3, and the 12 PSI sample had a pH of 4.4. So slight difference there. But the biggest thing, and I was super curious to see, was the IBU difference. Now,
this is always fascinating, by the way. We've worked with Oregon Brew Labs many times, specifically on IBU measurements. And you're gonna bring this up, so I'm gonna jump in front of you for a second. Lab IBU measurements have never been even close to our predictive measurements from our calculators. So keep that in mind. I know people are going to be flabbergasted, to use an old term, when you read what these IBUs are.
Yeah, so I sort of thought this might be coming because I'd previously done an experiment in collaboration with White Labs where we were comparing adding hops into the boil versus adding hops through a hop spider, just to see if there was an IBU difference. And the results were that I got a much lower IBU score from the labs than I was expecting from my brewing software. So I was kind of thinking that might happen again. Now, bear in mind, my recipe in Brewfather said an IBU prediction of 24.9. All right, so that's what I was kind of shooting for. The actual IBU, the actual measured IBU for the 12 PSI sample was only 9. Instead of basically 25. And for the 0 PSI sample was 7. This absolutely blew me away.
Here's the thing. If you already mentioned this, I missed it. The calculated, or the expected IBU from Brewfather, and I believe yours is probably set to the same, what do you use for your IBU measurement in Brewfather?
Whatever the default is.
Whatever the default is. So you have it as 25. IBU. 24.9 is what I'm seeing, right?
Right.
This came back as 7 and 9. this is a total aside. Homebrewers, use what works for you. We know that I know, I'm not going to speak for you, Martin, that when I'm using my calculator, I'm trying to look to see which one it is. I don't want to overspeak here. When we're using the calculators in our brewing calculators, these brewing design software things, we're going for what works for us. And we've developed this awareness or this knowledge of, the numbers that are going to create the bitterness profile that we are after. Just because we send it to a lab and it shows 7 and 9 doesn't mean I'm going to start designing my experiments to have 7 or 9 IBU. That would not be bitter enough for us. If my calculator, if Brewfather tells me that I've got, 9 IBU, and when I send it in, it's measured at 1 IBU, but I'm happy with my 25 IBU based on Brewfather, then that's what I'm sticking with that, right? I mean, does that make sense what I'm saying? Like, I don't want people to think that, I'm going to start designing my recipes that have this lower IBU because the lab says it, mine is naturally set to 10th. I didn't want to speak out of what yours, I'm assuming yours is at 10th as well.
Yeah, I just looked it up. It's also 10th. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a standard for homebrewers. What we have to accept is that 10th works for us so long as we view it through the lens of the 10th IBU formula, as opposed to, a lab measured formula. Why are they different? I don't really know. But anyways, that's my aside. I'm going to get off that little high horse here for a minute.
Yeah. Now, all of this was kind of beside the point. What I was most interested in is, what was the reason that we were fermenting under pressure in the first place? We were concerned about ester production in what we wanted to primarily be a clean lager. So were there more esters generated in the 0 PSI sample than the 12 PSI sample? So that was the part I was really interested in. Now, White Lab sent me a big long report with a bunch of esters I'd never heard of, and giving me precise measurements to the second decimal place as to what percentage of esters were in those. So we won't go through them all.
This is so interesting, dude. I'm looking at it right now. I'm sorry. Go. Yeah.
It's kind of crazy, but let's just pick one, which was isobutanol, which apparently is kind of a higher alcohol. So this is the potential for the fusel stuff, the fusel alcohols we were talking about, that can lead to a sort of an overly sweet or musty kind of taste or aroma. Now, there was a difference between these two. So the 0 PSI sample had a score of 34, whatever that means, but we'll worry about how relative they are. So it had a score of 34. The 12 PSI sample was indeed lower. So we had less of these higher alcohols. It was 19. So 19 over 34.
Well, and just to it's 19 ppm versus 34 ppm. That's parts per million, people. That sounds like a vast difference.
Yes.
Yes. But parts per million is parts per million. So 34 versus 19. Okay, carry on, Martin. We're gonna do this.
Right. So 34 versus 19 ppm. So basically, one way to think about this is like it's 50% more in that 0 PSI sample. My goodness, we made a difference after all. I guess my tasters really do suck. However, except there is a big caveat here. The sensory threshold for this, the ability for anybody to notice, is 200 parts per million. So we're talking about the difference between 19 and 34 when the threshold to notice anything is 200. And if you go through all of the higher alcohols and all of the esters here, in many cases, the 0 PSI sample had slightly higher numbers or slightly lower numbers, but they were all miles below the threshold. So there's just no chance that anybody was actually going to notice.
I cannot help myself here, Martin. So I'm going to do my version of a quick rundown of this just to send this, this point home. Higher alcohols. You said isobutanol, or however you say that. That's that alcohol sweet musty thing. There's also 1-propanol, and that's alcohol musty. The taste threshold is 800 ppm on 1-propanol. Your 0 PSI sample had 22. The 12 PSI sample had 19. That's effectively the same, both well under the threshold. Let's move down to the esters, because I think for lager brewing, that's where most people are focused. If you ferment it warm, you're going to create a fruit bomb that's definitely out of style, and I'm going to be able to taste the difference. Well, let's see about that. So for the 0 PSI example, ethyl acetate, which is that pear solventy kind of sweet thing, we've all tasted that. I think most of us have. It's very common. That to me is the primary ester when using like English strains, classic, British strains. Flavor threshold 33 ppm. I love this one. The 0 pressure batch had 20 ppm. So under the taste threshold. The batch that was fermented under pressure, get this, 24 ppm. It actually had more of that ester than the one fermented under no pressure. Let's move on. Ethyl hexanoate, that's the apple peel flavor. The flavor threshold on that one, the ppm threshold is 0.23 ppm. The one fermented under no pressure, 0.04 ppm, effectively no ethyl hexanoate. The one fermented under pressure, 0.06. Again, pretty much identical, which is to say that it just wasn't there. It was not even anywhere close. The flavor threshold. Ethyl octanoate. This is that apricot floral characteristic you can get, ester that you can get into beer. The taste threshold on that is 0.9 ppm. The one fermented under pressure, 0.59. The one fermented under no pressure, 0.57. That's effectively identical as well. Pressure did not have a major impact on that whatsoever. Isoamyl acetate. Oh boy, we all know the dreaded banana ester that you do not want in a lager beer in particular. 1.4 ppm is where human beings are able to taste that. Let's just pretend that there are, quote, these super tasters who love to brag about being a super taster out there who are really sensitive to that banana-y isoamyl acetate. Let's say that their threshold is 1.0 even. The version that was fermented under no pressure, 0.77 ppm, still under the super taster's flavor threshold. The one fermented under pressure, 0.66. That is about a 0.11 ppm difference, both still. That is the only one of the esters, by the way, that was lower for the for batch fermented under pressure compared to the one fermented under no pressure, but still both under the typically accepted flavor threshold. So there's that as well. Let's move into VDKs. These are the vicinal diketones, which are your diacetyl and stuff like that. So diacetyl, flavor threshold, 0.15. If you're unfamiliar with diacetyl or diacetyl, that's that buttery kind of slick mouthfeel, tastes like buttered popcorn type of characteristic. The one fermented under no pressure, 0.026 ppm. Let's just call that 0.03. Again, flavor threshold is 0.15. That was actually lower for the no pressure batch than it was for the pressurized batch, which was at 0.04 ppm, still under the flavor threshold. 2,3 pentanedione, whatever. That's that sweet kind of honeyish toffee-like flavor. Flavor threshold of 1 ppm. Both batches were under 0.015 ppm. Are you catching a trend here? Finally, acetaldehyde, flavor threshold is 25 ppm. The batch that was fermented under zero pressure, 1.53 ppm. We're talking 23.5 ppm lower than what it would take to detect it in that beer. The batch fermented under pressure was a little bit closer to that 25 at 3.44 ppm. What we can say about this, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, Martin, is that not only did our crazy dumb tasters out there who have terrible palates, were unable to tell a difference between these beers, a freaking computer in a lab could not tell a difference between these beers. If you're still out there swearing that fermenting a lager at 68 degrees, this is the hard evidence you've been begging us to produce. It's right here. And we're not, unless you just don't believe that we're not lying about it, I don't know what else to say, that whether you're fermenting warm or not, none of these esters were anywhere near the flavor threshold, first off. So that right there just supports the warm fermentation isn't going to ruin your lager beer, at least when using these robust yeasts and such. but fermenting under pressure did nothing. It had zero objective impact whatsoever. So why people continue to swear by this method, it just seems like an illusory prophylactic to me. I don't know. I'll shut up now. You go, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, what's wild to me is although, everything is miles under the threshold, but for every ester that was measured, actually the esters were higher in every case for the sample that was fermented under pressure. So not only did it not reduce esters, it actually slightly increased them, not in a perceptible way. But the other thing that I got from this is I just wish I could send every one of my beers to White Labs and get this report. And then next time I take one of my lagers to the homebrew club and they are evaluating it, there is always that one guy that says, oh, I'm picking up diacetyl in this. And I could show him that, no, you're not. You're absolutely not. The lab proves it.
Your arrogance is picking it up perhaps, but not your mouth. Good Lord. And that's the thing is it's like, I get that when people really delve into a hobby, the Dunning-Kruger effect is alive and well, trust me. But even beyond that, you've got people who just pride themselves on their tasting abilities. And when you do that, when I hear somebody talking about them being a super taster, I view you as, first off, probably quite insecure, and you're trying to make yourself look bigger than you really are by bragging about this. But secondly, you probably don't actually know what you're talking about. I mean, if I'm offending you, then that's probably a sign that you should look in the mirror and figure this stuff out. You are not as good as you think you are. I'm not as good as I think I am. Martin, no offense, either are you, pal. That's just human nature. Let's chill out a little bit and just enjoy this hobby. Let people do it the way they want and stop pretending that you know the right way. So much in brewing and so much in life, good Lord, was developed by people who don't have the knowledge, the skill sets, the freaking technology that we have today to do things differently. I'll let that apply however you want to apply it, but it's not to just beer. We do have some reader comments we're going to get to here. The first one comes from our friend Will Allwart, who I know I may have even been on this episode with you of the Brülosophy show. Will says, I love that the lab data supports the sensory tasting data. Maybe Brülosophy tasters aren't so bad after all. Maybe they're not. I'm with you, Will.
Yeah, wouldn't it be fun to actually do this with a bunch more experiments that came back significant or non-significant and see if there is a correlation there? Are people just getting lucky, or is there actually something there that they can taste the threshold difference?
I know. It's fascinating. Final comment comes from Eric Webster, who says, very interesting that a split wort batch that had identical lab tested FGs would have differences in ABV. Not a ton, but not zero either. Not all entirely below threshold. Pressure resulted in less higher alcohols, but more VDKs, aldehydes, and esters. Contrary to the popular opinion, I ferment under pressure and will continue to do so for the one indisputable benefit of faster carbonation. A 12 psi batch at 65F or 19C will have 1.58 volumes of CO2, a great start to the eventual 2 to 2.5 volumes of final carbonation level I'm looking for. I mean, honestly, look, I'm not one to try to get people to brew the way I do. I don't care what you do. I honestly don't care. You can piss in your beer if you want to. Just don't serve it to me. I don't care. I'm with Eric, though, that if you're going to ferment under pressure, the only benefit, and this is not the first time we've had a non-significant pressurized fermentation experiment. We'll probably get to more of them here in the future. The one indisputable benefit is the fact that you are pre-carbonating that beer. Great, wonderful. If that's what you want to do, then do it. And if you have a spunding valve, all the better, because you're not wasting, store-bought CO2 on this. You're just kind of using what's there, and hey, no harm, no foul. But you're not going to harm your beer by fermenting it under no pressure either. I mean, this whole idea is just laughable to me at this point.
Yeah, this actually changed a little bit of how I approach fermenting under pressure because, in this experiment, I added CO2 from my CO2 tank to get this thing started. So it was immediately starting at 12 psi. But now if I'm going to ferment under pressure for whatever reason, unless it's an experiment, I don't bother doing that. I just let it naturally build up that CO2 to whatever I've set that spunding valve to, and then not add in any of my own. So I'm that way able to get the beer under pressure without having to actually use any CO2, and then carbonate the beer also without using any of my own CO2. So it's a nice little saving there.
Yeah, I think it's great. And again, we are, I understand, and I know that there will be people who scoff at me saying this, but I hear from a lot of commercial brewers who listen to the show, who read our stuff. We love you. Thanks for listening. If you got this on in the brewery right now, we're speaking about 5-gallon batches of beer here. Is there a difference on a mass scale? I would coordinate with a commercial brewer on this one who's willing to risk I understand there's a lot of fear in fermenting lagers warm. If you want to do it, reach out to me, man. We'll set up a cool little collaborative experiment. I am convinced, just based on what I've studied and read about pressurized fermentation, that it's not doing what you think it's doing. This is one of those very few moments where, or I guess variables that I'm ready to just kind of toss in the bin. It over and over and over again. But if it makes you feel better, by all means. That is all the time we've got for this episode. Don't forget to check out the rad brewing content that Martin is creating over at The Brülosophy Show, which you can subscribe to at youtube.com/@thebrülosophy-show. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brülosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown.